Howdy, Jacob here. Today we're going to do a more in-depth analysis on Allison Transmission Holdings. I believe I did my initial video a little less than a month ago, so it hasn't been too long. But let's remind ourselves of some of the financials before going back into some of the notes and everything from reading the quarterly reports and 10Ks and 10Qs. Just keep in mind that everything I say is my opinion. Do what you want with it. My goal is just for you to get a better understanding of some of the more in-depth things to look at. This isn't end all be all final results, but just meant to aid you in your own valuation. So for me, um, I want to go over the financials before getting into the notes. So if we remind ourselves, revenue was 2.1 in 2014 and then up to 3 billion in 2023. So not a lot of growth, but definitely some growth. And both the operating and gross margins are up a couple percentage points um, from 10 years ago. So that's pretty substantial. Last 3 years, we're looking at mid-teens ROIC, which is pretty great. And then from a debt perspective, they do have 2.5 billion in long-term debt, 555 million cash and cash equivalents, and their production of cash flow, free cash flow, is pretty substantial. Where in the last 10 years, their lowest free cash flow is right around 500 million, um, or let's say 450 million to be conservative. That's their lowest in the last 10 years of free cash flow. So pretty impressive from that standpoint. Now let's go into some of the notes that I wrote down. Actually, the first thing I want to look at is the share repurchases. So you can see that. Let's actually go to their income statement. Their shares have halved in the last 9 years. So in 2014, they had 180 million shares outstanding. Now they have 90. So they've been buying back shares heavily, and you want companies to be buying back shares when they're cheap. And so that's the most ideal thing, is when the share price is extremely cheap, then buying back shares is a good thing. And then also, not the best thing, but not a bad thing if it's a great business, is to just do essentially dollar cost averaging, where you're buying back shares really no matter what. And in essence, you're going to get the return of the business. But here we see that they're really buying back a lot of shares kind of all the time. It looks like they were share price wise pretty flat for about 2 years or 3 years. So between 2020 and 2022, they kind of were in the pretty consistent range of $35 to $40 a share, and they did buy back shares pretty heavily back then. But even in the most recent year, they did buy back 5 million shares outstanding, and their exit price was actually quite a bit higher. So $50 for the price, for their average price bought back in 2023, whereas in 2020 and 2021, 2022, you're looking at high 30s. Um, so before we do evaluation, we will get to see whether those were actually like great prices to buy back or not. But they are very heavily buying back shares. So the goal for 2023, set in their most recent quarterly report, was margin expansion, and they achieved that. So this was actually their, I believe, 22 Q4 report. They said that their goal was margin expansion, and at the end of 23, after the year, they were able to expand margins, and they supplied guidance on the numbers, which is nice, but didn't delve too deep into focusing on 2024 and beyond. So, like most companies, they just have maybe a quarter out projection. But there are companies out there that give their like not best case, but like their like long term goal, where like in 3 years we expect to achieve margins along the line of 30%. Um, XYZ, whatever. But here we just have short term guidance, which nothing wrong with that as long as they, keep improving the business the way we want. Percentage of sales, we have 66% of sales from on highway, 6% off highway, 5% defense, and then 23% service parts and equipment. So of the on highway, you have 54% class 8 trucks, 27% 6 to 7, 29% other. So basically, within the trucks, they do manufacturing of those they do manufacturing within each level of truck. 90% of their on-highway sales are directly to original equipment manufacturers. So you will see a good amount of sales being towards one customer because they're using that um, equipment to manufacture the final product. Their top 5 customers make up 52% of sales, with their top 3 making up 18, 11, and 11. So as I said, they do have percentage of their revenue going towards directly to the manufacturer, and so that manufacturer would technically be the client in this case, where before they create the end unit, and so that is something to definitely point out here, that their top 3 customers make up 40% of their sales, which is humongous. But they do have a long history with these clients. They were founded back in 1915, and with their main clients, they have a long history to where they should be in a good spot. But definitely something to point out, as they lose one of those customers, that is a huge hit to revenue. Total net sales for 2023 were up 10%, carried by a 13% increase in their North American on-highway and an 18% increase in their service parts and equipment. So you can see that their on-highway makes up 66% of their revenue, and that portion of revenue increased 13%. So very impressive. Their use of cash over the last 3 years has averaged about 15% to dividend, 60% share repurchases, and then just a little bit going towards acquisition, reinvestment, and debt repayment. And so we do see that they do have a good amount of debt, $2.5 billion worth of debt, where $618 million is due in 2026, $400 million in 2027, $500 million in 2029, $1 billion in 2031, with just $6 million in the next year. So they do have a lot of debt, but it's not due recently. That's fine. Again, I've brought up the example of if you have a 30-year mortgage loan, it's not too concerning if your debt is more than what your current assets are. Not current assets, but your total assets are. That's fine because you have such a long period to pay it off, which we do. I mean, we don't see 30 years here, but $618 million is the first large amount due, and it's due in 2026. So they do have 2 years. 2 to 3 years to pay that off, and their production of free cash flow is close to that 450 range, $450 million, and on their balance sheet they have $555 million cash on hand. So it should be they do have a lot of debt, but it's not concerning given their cash and given their production of free cash flow. But something you want to point out is that they have heavily done share repurchases and dividends, and due to their debt being due in those years, you might not see as much payment going towards that. Obviously, they could refinance it, but I'd assume that they would refinance part of it, pay off part of it, to where more of their cash flow is going towards that rather than dividend and share repurchases. So with all that said, and with all those notes, I think off my initial assumptions, I just really brought down the share repurchases a bit, because I'm looking at what they're doing with their free cash flow, and them paying out 80 million, let's say, and then on the share change side, 6% of shares at 7, you're looking at right about 420, so 500. Maybe let's bring this down to 4%, because that would bring this down to about 280. So this is about 360 million of their free cash flow going towards dividends and share repurchases, the rest going towards repaying that debt. And so with those assumptions, and I say final, loosely, I say that it does need to fall to about a $40 range. But I will say it wasn't there too long ago. So maybe them repurchasing under 40 was a good return on the money invested. But as of right now, I think it's just shot up so fast. That's just the price point that I'm looking for at this moment. So please do your own research. Hopefully you enjoy the video. Use it in conjunction with your own analysis, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.